Hey there, my name's Mark McCartney and welcome to the What is a Good Life podcast. Over the last 3 years, I've interviewed over 200 people around this question, not to prescribe you with the universal answer, but to help you explore this question for yourself. I'm hoping the guests' experiences, curiosities, and inquiries will prompt your own inquiry into what this question means for you. While I'm also trying to share with you what I perceive to be more genuine expressions of the human experience and indeed more meaningful conversations. Which brings us to this week and the 95th episode of the What is a Good Life podcast, and I'm delighted to introduce Madelaine Ley as our guest. Madelaine is a philosopher, a spiritual ecologist, and contemplative artist. Her diverse work includes lecturing at Delft University of Technology and the Lassonde School of Engineering in Canada on digital citizenship, responsible AI, intersectional approaches to technology, and robot ethics. Hosting sacred sessions, which are non-religious gatherings that blend philosophy, science, art, contemplative practices, and collective reflection. Writing and podcasting for Beauty in the Mire, and experimenting with contemplative art. In 2022, she was named one of the 100 Brilliant Women in AI Ethics by Lighthouse 3, and she's been featured by the BBC, Yes Magazine, and Life itself, as well as being funded by the European Pavilion, Horizon 2020, and the Social Science Research Council of Canada. In this inspiring conversation, Madelaine shares how she is deepening her awareness of her embodied experience of life. We discuss how the birth of her daughter revealed an inner bravery, while also exploring the importance of embracing grief, along with the profound grounding and lessons she received from her spiritual mentor in embodying agenda-free presence and resisting the urge to fix and give advice. This whole conversation is a wonderful invitation to pay attention to the lived and felt experience of your life and to recognize the wisdom that our bodies can offer. Look, I enjoyed this conversation immensely. Madelaine has a wonderful capacity to give words and expression to processes that are occurring within us that you may only vaguely have a sense of. So I think you're going to take a lot from this conversation. And if you enjoy this episode, please like, share, and subscribe if you're on YouTube. And please continue to leave your lovely reviews if you're on the podcasting platforms. Please check out the show notes below for ways of following Madelaine's work, as well as for the podcast newsletter, where you can read about the reflections that these conversations are evoking in me, as well as ways for contacting me for further collaborations, whether that's around one-on-one coaching, the free silent conversations that I offer weekly, as well as executive team leadership coaching. So that's all I have to say for this week. I look forward to carrying on the conversation with you next week. So without further ado, the 95th episode of the What is a Good Life podcast. Madelaine, thank you so much for joining me today on the What is a Good Life podcast. Since our last conversation, I've been very much intrigued to see where the hell we go today.
Me too. I'm excited.
So, as you know, I tend to kick these things off with the question of, is there a question that's accompanying you as you move through life?
And I love this question. As a listener to the podcast, I know this one's coming. So I'm a philosopher. And so a lot of my life and my time is taken up by trying to find the right kind of questions to ask. And there's a real sense of curiosity in my life. And so question asking is almost ever present. But I think I find surprising to myself even is that the answer to your question is actually not so much words, but a feeling. It's like a feeling of a question. And so I'll try to describe it. I think I have been trying to feel out for my life is how can I live in a way where, and this is the best way I can say it, is living right at the edges of my skin, sort of reverberating right at the edges. And this requires also not receding into myself and hiding, and also importantly, not stretching myself thin and outwards. So sort of holding this fullness, full inhabiting of my life, of my body, of this existence in such a way that I'm not falling back or reaching out too much?
This is a really gorgeous inquiry. Then, how have you, from as you said, like from someone who's used to formulating the right question, how have you come to this place where it's this delightful kind of not going beyond the stretching beyond the extremities of my body and not receding too far back into it? How have you arrived here for now anyway?
Um, oh, like any good arrival, lots of struggle and challenge. So when I say it's a lifelong questioning, feel like this embodied questioning is really, I expect it to be lifelong.
Yeah.
And I have not arrived at the answer. And what I think, what's so I'm trained as a philosopher in academia, but philosophy is something that I do in all aspects of my life. It just also happens to be in academia. And I think that to me, it really is this vocation of questioning and curiosity and a lot of grace-filled asking. So not trying to pinpoint down answers, but rather open up possibilities through questioning. And for a long time, I think I was trying to pin things down in language that was specific to my training. And in academia and in Western academic philosophy, a lot of it, including what I did, was based on logical argumentation. So this thing of like, well, if A and then there's B, then it must be C. And you're trying to do sort of, it's like, intellectual mathematics of sorts, where there's an answer at the end. And as I was going along with this work in philosophy, what was starting to happen is that I would have these strong intuitions that were pulling me in an illogical direction.
Right.
And I'm sort of, you can't really see, but I'm sort of like holding my belly. It's very belly oriented knowledge. And you're not taught in academia to follow your gut or follow your intuition or follow things that don't follow from the previous points in the argument. And so finding myself here where I'm moving it seems like my work is moving much more intuitively and out of, my sort of creative intuition. That's really been a stepping away from this sort of logical, linear approach to life and to questions.
Before I kind of project too much onto that experience, could you give me a feel of what that kind of stepping away from how that was experienced when you started to really pay attention to that movement in the belly or the gut?
Hmm. Yeah, I think maybe I just tell you a little story, I think is often the
Perfect.
best way. A recent story. So I've just finished a PhD in philosophy of technology. And halfway through, I have to just explain for a moment. The PhD is actually, I'm a philosopher at an engineering school. And I was hired to do a project on robotics and robot ethics. And the idea was that this company would pay for the PhD, and I was to sort of help them make responsible robots for grocery stores and distribution centers. This does not sound very exciting, I should say. I will fully admit. So at first, I thought, no, there's something beautiful here, because anywhere there's robots, for now anyways, there's people. And anywhere there's people, I'm interested. I don't care about robots too much, but I do care about people. So then I thought, okay, well, this is an interesting place. I want to go to somewhere unlikely, like a distribution center or grocery store that wants to have robots. And I want to say, no, we should really care about the people who are here. And so that's why I started the PhD. But what I noticed was, for the first half of the PhD, I was just tinkering with what was possible. So you're saying, I think we should make the robot, move at a certain speed so that it's not too frightening. We shouldn't make it look like a human so that people don't get attached to it. These are sort of small design features that I was it's like tinkering with, nothing bold, it's like I imagine like little dials. I'm like, this a little bit more, this a little more. And then halfway through my PhD, I realized like I shop. I don't shop at any of the stores that these robots would be at. I shop in a really community way. I wouldn't have my children eat from those stores because it's largely unhealthy food that I don't agree with. And and I think that the whole purpose of those robotics is to have our stuff come to us more efficiently so we can get our stuff straight to our door in 24 hours or less. And I'm like, I don't order things like that. All my whole life is going in a different direction from my own work. But I didn't see a possibility to incorporate this more creative um, political aspect into my PhD. So then I just had a meltdown.
Yes.
Always a good way to like break down everything. So it wasn't like a really conscious like 1, 2, 3 step where I had this like breakthrough. It was like I had a meltdown. I was very pregnant with my first child, and then after her birth, there was something about her birth with that was such a it was a beautiful long birth, and then having my first child and spending all those months with her in the beginning so intimately. And there was something about, the best way to describe it is, I don't know, she made me feel, I think probably because of the birth too, but she made me feel really brave.
Hmm.
And made me feel like, and also just felt like when you see a little baby and you're with the newborn baby, it's like life is so precious. Please do not waste this beautiful thing that we have. Making some company, like appeasing some company with your PhD and not writing with your heart. What a waste. So I really felt that's where the switch was. It was like my daughter, I thank her now. She's only 3. So, I'll keep thanking her so she'll know. But I don't know. It was her, it was motherhood. It was this breakdown, which happens in new parenthood. And with a whole lot of fearfulness, but I think the bravery outbeat the fearfulness. Yeah.
It's so, I don't know, from so many of the people that I've interviewed, it just seems to me that the very state that we're avoiding so often, like a meltdown, I'll say, even from my own experience, a breakdown, or whatever terminology we want to cloak some of these experiences in. It's amazing how effective it is at also kind of maybe shattering or deconstructing a lot of our really strong attachments to how we think or perceive the world.
Mm-hmm.
And how it almost seems to me that in that shattering, almost, I'll say, in my experience, there's so much more freedom to move then, or so many things become a possibility where they previously weren't. Like
Yeah.
just in terms of potential moves. Just curious from your perspective, and I definitely want to touch on the experience of bravery after having a daughter as well. But just from your sense of just that experience, like how did you start to, what suddenly became possible that wasn't even visible before, I guess?
Yeah. I think, there's a few things. I've really reflected on this in my life, and I think I've been very lucky to have a few meltdowns. And so, and I'll explain. I think I've been lucky to have a few like breakdowns, shattering. I love this. I think like a rupture is a really nice way to say it as well, where you're moving around like habitually, and then there's this rupture, and you're called to attention is sort of a nice way of putting it, but you're forced to attention to reprioritize, right? Like it's not always this thing that you're doing so nicely and consciously and tidily. And so I say I'm lucky because I've been through difficult things before. And so I sort of know the experience of it. I know how I sort of know oh dear, here we go.
Right.
And it's always in the case of, well, no, there's a few different ways I think I've experienced this, but there's been a few times in my life when another example that's coming to mind is when I dropped out of university. When I first went to university, I dropped out after a year, and that was a really hard decision to come to. And then there was another one. The other one that is coming to mind is a breakup from a long-term relationship, and then this thing in the PhD. And in all cases, I was doing something that I knew I shouldn't. My whole body, my stomach was saying, "Stop this! You're not going on the right track." There's a beautiful option where you can be creative and you can express yourself fully and you can explore. And for some reason, you've chosen this option where you're sort of like putting yourself in a tiny little box, and
Yeah.
and it's almost like my body is just like, okay, well, if you keep doing that, it's just going to get more stressed. Like my stomach's like, it's fine. but if you keep going, you're like the stomach's going to hurt more and more. It's just going to get more and more stressed. So and my hands always get eczema on them
Right.
when I am doing, and it's exactly the feeling of like, if I'm doing something that I know I shouldn't be doing for other people, and there's another option that's so beautiful that just not like that just requires some bravery and a choice to choose it. And so I'm lucky because I've done that before, so I know I can do it. I know that I can go through a difficult time.
So I think this is something I haven't talked about in much depth, I guess, or even asked many questions on it. But the way you described that resonates really deeply with my own experience. There's like and I don't even know if it's if it's an awareness that comes to somebody after really paying attention to their lives, in these kind of maybe grandiose ways I could think about it. But that an energy visits my stomach or some part of my body that it's so clear that this decision will lead to more discomfort. It's not necessarily going to be that your life's going to end or that there won't be any benefits to this decision, but there's a really clear forewarning almost in my experience with this. Just from your experience, how have you listened to that, or what's created the space for it? And what was even your experience of it, I guess?
Yeah, I can get so in my head and running and planning and strategizing, and I get a real almost like high off of that, as I think many people do. And that's when, so back to the beginning question you asked, that's when I'm stretched out too far.
Okay.
And sometimes that's useful in a moment. I think that what I'm trying to describe is much more fluctuating. I'm not describing anything that's stabilized. There's so much movement in this sort of inhabiting oneself that I'm trying to describe. And but when I get too stretched out for too long, then it's almost like my body is calling me back in. It's like, yeah, come. Yeah, not no no. It's probably before maybe like, and I'm getting better at listening. It's like, okay, come back now, come back now, come back now. It's like, okay, you better come back now. You have to come back now. So it becomes increasingly more stern, I think. And and I just know, I think that over time I've just learned to listen to that, and I hope to be able to listen to that sooner rather than later. And then it's also the eczema on my hands really comes up when I'm not listening to
Yeah.
listening to myself. It's like, it's just exactly how it happens. And I noticed that only through many experiences of it. And then I thought, what is with this? And then that's where I pinpointed it. Yeah.
That's that's a really beautiful observation,
Mm.
and even just with what's physically occurring on your hands in that
Mhm.
circumstance. But I love this. The image I had in my head was of just the mind almost projecting ourselves out of our body, and our body
Yeah.
gently gently calling us or encouraging us back until it has to make more dramatic calls or
Yeah.
requests.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And it's like the body. So sometimes I really do like this idea. You said shattering, meltdown. I like the rupture is something I use in my philosophical work. It sort of comes from French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who's a phenomenologist, and that's just the philosophy of experience. And he talks about how we're moving around. He talks a lot about movement. So you're moving around in your habit flow of your body, and then there'll be something like you stub your toe, and it's this rupture of the flow experience where you're sort of called to the present. What's interesting too is that he talks about it's a light. We have these ruptures all the time in our life because we're bodies that are changing all the time, and so I don't know how this will fit into this conversation, but underlying it, I think, a sense of mortality is undergirding a lot of my movements and decisions in life as well. So maybe we can get into that. But with Merleau-Ponty talks about how these ruptures happen in your life because we are bodies alive and we are bodies decaying and alive as well. And so in our changes, my 3-year-old daughter moves through the house in a different way than I do. And when I was pregnant, I would have these ruptures all the time because when you get bigger and bigger, you're 9 months pregnant trying to get through just like the door or something like this you're suddenly very aware of the door and the house is trying to move around and these sorts of things. So you have, and then you're not pregnant anymore and you can move in a different way. And so I think the body, the body is such a beautiful, it's like the site of wisdom and so many wisdoms. And I think that the eczema, the maybe stomach stress is, I would just say in knots would be for me, nothing too far along. But that was like the body was almost, it was doing the rupture for me to call me back.
The mortality stuff.
I thought you'd like that.
Yeah, I know. Strange that such a word brings such a aliveness to my inquiry.
Yeah.
Just please go on in that direction if you don't
Yeah.
mind.
Yeah, I haven't had a lot of chance to talk about it because for me, it's something within my own philosophy and my own life that's really important. Um, so my mom's a minister, and she didn't become a minister until I was until I was a teenager. But before that, she was always like really part of the community, not always in a church community, but in the community. So, and I'm the youngest child of 3. And so I think if anyone knows what that placement's like in a family, you're often like carted around with your parents or you're sort of like tagged along a little bit. And so I would be with my mom a lot, and we would go visit people who are not feeling well, or go visit people at the hospital, and going through difficult things as well as joyful things. But I feel like I got a real exposure to just the full spectrum of life, including death. And I guess I don't really see life and death as two opposites. Maybe they're opposites, but they're entangled in as one. I don't think you can understand one without the other. Maybe you should do a podcast. What is a good death?
Yeah, it's literally a lady who is a death doula said for her the two questions are completely, they're one and the same.
I agree.
Yeah.
So I was around a lot of illness and death early in my life, and then throughout. And then when I was there's 2 more pieces. Then there was I volunteered at a hospice when I was 23 for a year. I was working on a thesis on another French philosopher, Emmanuel Levinas, and I was interested in his understanding of death. And so I thought, well, I better go hang out with a lot of people who are dying. So that's what I did, and that was for a year. And this was this really beautiful experience of just sitting with people and getting them water and I don't don't know, just what I think what I did at that time was practicing agenda-free presence is what the phrase that I use for it, agenda-free presence. And then I also worked as alongside an inner city chaplain in Toronto for over 10 years. And while that wasn't hospice specific, we would spend time in hospitals and in and out of hospitals. So when people were dying, we would go there and advocate for their care, but also do the work of sitting and being with, which is profound work. And then I've had 4 instances of close people dying, all sudden. I've had some people who have died. No, I just grandparents, I think, and they were so older, and we weren't super super close. But the 4 people who died that were deeply deeply close to me, all completely sudden, totally unexpected. So I think because of those 4 experiences, the suddenness is not lost on me. That our days are, your life could end any time, not just in many many decades. And so that finitude really imbues this, like it's such a profound and precious thing that we're here, and such an unlikely story that we're here at all. It's so precious is the right word, I think, and so that the awareness of death, the respect for death, is something that infuses my life with the sense of preciousness, I guess.
How do you hold that? Like, is that almost something that's been embodied because of those 4 like for all the experiences you just mentioned there, or is that also a deliberate kind of mental exercise or checking in? Like, how would you say you experience that? Like what would you even say the source of that imbuing is, if you get me?
Yeah. No, it's not. There's no sort of intentional practice around it. I think that
Right.
maybe, and that's probably, maybe it is because the awareness of death has come through all these sort of different sources. And so I know that there's some meditation practices of sitting with your death and these things. I don't have any of that. But it is something that comes up sometimes in a way of fear, and sometimes I'll be really compelled. Now I have 2 children. I feel like a deep grief sometimes about ever having just an awareness that I won't always be with them in a physical way, and so that can happen. It sort of comes to me in different ways. So yeah, grief, an awareness of like a deep love for my husband that I hope we get to be together for many more decades, and that one day we won't be. And so again, I think, and I think, there's a tendency to sort of skirt away from sadness or from grief, or this sort of like anticipatory grief. But I saw something the other day I loved. It was like grief is like a love song. Like grief is because you love something and you feel so strongly about something. So I'm not too afraid of grief either, and I have experienced it these four times quite deeply. It means that you're attached and you're connected, and you've loved. And
This is really beautiful, because I think I've seen it with my wife at times, even just grieving phases in our 14-month-old's development that will no longer be present. And while there is some degree of deliberateness to it, because I play a particular song, I think they're called the Cinema Orchestra. I forget the name, but the song is "To Build a Home," and the video is around in a euthanasia and assisted death, and the actors do it so beautifully that sometimes I just play that video. Could be once every 3 months or something, or maybe even a bit more frequently, depending on whatever the mood is. And I'll just feel like what it could be like to, potentially lose my wife. And so sometimes she'll come into the living room, she'll see my eyes misty, and she goes, "Are you listening to that song again?"
yeah.
But what I love about it is, it's not a, like, it's not something I set a reminder for. There's something about that feeling that I think very much dovetails what you're describing there, or like is an appreciation for what's here, an appreciation for what the grief could hold, and
Mm-hmm.
not to brush away any present moment disturbances or arguments or something, but just for some degree of awareness, like, or a wider appreciation for what this thing is. And even with my daughter, sometimes walking down the street, I do wonder, what if this was the last time I could do this, like,
Mm-hmm.
and not in a sense that I'll suddenly just, will do the wildest things, but just maybe squeeze her a little tighter in that moment, or watch the leaves a little bit more closely, like whatever it may be. I think it's the way you're describing it there. It's such a beautiful invitation to appreciate this life. And also, I don't know about you, but it welcomes grief a bit more. Like, it seems like an open invitation to that also being a part of life.
Yeah, absolutely. And just having the full spectrum of what a life includes, which is challenges and difficulties. It's not all smooth, and we're not always well. We're sick, and I'm always drawn to this word. I think, like, decay. I don't know,
Mm.
maybe because it seems a bit provocative or something, but um, it's just really sort of trying to be honest about the fullness of this human experience, or this experience of being alive, which is that there's also this decay, and composting is a word I hear a lot too as well. It's this, like, renewal is also is a decay, and composting and death as well. And what you were saying too about the song, and walking with your daughter is, I think what it does is sort of, it gives you some perspective, and you're drawn back into the moment. Like, as you said, nothing crazy. I don't want to go skydiving or something like this. I mean, some
Yeah.
people might, but for me, it's like the thing that I want to do is I want to, like, put my to-do list away and just focus on my child who's right in front of me.
Right.
this isn't this is a great practice then.
Yeah, yeah, completely.
Yeah.
There was an expression you used earlier, agenda-free presence.
Mm.
And I know the context that you mentioned it was in being with people that are dying. Um, what, how did you come to that expression? Has that been something that's influenced even some of the work that you do, or just even your engagement with life, I guess?
Yes. Okay. This is wonderful, because then I get to tell you about somebody I loved and lost. He was one of these people who died very suddenly, and was my spiritual mentor. And Reverend Roger Hunter, a Toronto inner city chaplain, and rough around the edges, fierce, sort of, I would say, like, crusty Scottish Presbyterian minister, but fierce in love,
Okay.
but crusty nonetheless. And so he went to do his master's in theology, which is the process you do for becoming a Christian minister. And I'm not religious, but I was always drawn to his way. And when he was going through his education, he realized that there was this whole group. So he didn't want to go into a church. He realized there's this whole group in Toronto that were living in what is called boarding homes, that was completely unattended to. So there would be chaplains in hospitals, churches, of course, the mental health institution, and shelters. But then there was this whole group of people that were living in boarding homes that didn't have any access to spiritual care. And in boarding homes in Toronto, in Canadian context, is best described as low income housing, but they're unregulated. And so nobody checks in on the safety of them, or any of the regulations that sort of keep a place safe and caring. And so what will happen is you get 3 meals a day, you get your medication given to you, And there's supposed to be somebody to care for you, but this person is often undertrained and often in a precarious immigration situation. And what Roger found when he was going around the city, he found that the only people that were coming into these homes from the outside would be paid to be there. So be a police officer, a social worker, a nurse. Those are the three main people that would be coming in. And when they're coming in like this, they're coming to check off a box. Did you take your medication? Were you on time for your curfew? These sorts of questions. And then people leave. And so in these homes where in a Canadian context, we call it, it's like their revolving door mental health policy. You go between the mental health, the institution, the hospital, you go to the street, you go to the boarding home, you go to jail sometimes, and you go like this because it's a mess of a system. And the boarding homes are supposed to be where home is not the word to use for such a place. It's often unsafe. It's absolutely many times the context is uncaring. And so what Roger did was he said, okay, I want to attend to what he was calling the poverty of companionship. And so what we would do is he would gather a group of volunteers and link them up with one house. And we would go with some food once a week and just sit and be together. And his rules were this: no fixing, no advice. No fixing, no advice. And that's it. So every week you go in with food and you just be together. And sometimes that's really hard. But it is this practice of agenda-free presence. I would call it radical hanging out. It's like, yeah, just like this, like really profound hanging out. And what's important here is that this posture of charity, of like a hierarchy, sort of, which can happen in a lot of volunteer situations, it just dissipated. You really sat together and chatted about sports. Sometimes, a lot of times, there was a lot of silence, like a lot of silence. When I first started, I found this very hard to bear. I wanted to, shouldn't we be talking? Something like this. And eventually I would sink into the silence of it. And I think I did that for 12 years, every week. And that's where that practice came from. And I would say I didn't understand this at the time, but now I understand that was a deep spiritual training, because I was with Roger once a week, going around the city in different boarding homes and in hospitals and things. And now I know that I had this like deep training in something like agenda-free presence. Yeah.
Well, that's absolutely gorgeous. Yeah. I don't know why, but I just kind of feel compelled to ask you, what did Roger mean to you?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. He was my spiritual mentor. And what he meant to me was many of the themes we've already talked about, is this full spectrum of the human experience. And I think what his gift to me and his gift to so many others was recognition. And recognition that, I think because I'm sort of smiley and I like to laugh a lot, people think I'm sort of just wholly nice or something. Like I get sort of put into a box a little bit, and that has been my experience in many different contexts. And what I liked about Roger is, I think the phrase, I wrote this in an essay recently, and I was like, he always recognized that I had a little bit of bite.
Nice.
And he wasn't scared about that, and he wasn't. He just knew it. And we really connected on that. Like, I think that he saw sort of a fullness of me, and I was so attracted to that. And yeah.
Well, there's After you said like no fixing, no advice,
Mm.
I just wanted to leave that hang for a couple of minutes, like for all of our relationships, basically,
Mhm.
uh, in whatever way we can accommodate or handle that. I think that offers a beautiful space or a possibility to a relationship. Also, just the removing of the hierarchy in volunteering is I think deeply underappreciated.
Mhm.
Um, but more than anything, this his capacity to his capacity to for you to feel fully seen and recognized. It sounds like such a glory, and 12 years. So this isn't a fly by night experience. This is a rather large sample size of experiences.
Mhm.
Um, I can only imagine, especially in hindsight or reflecting back on it, how it would have felt like quite a deep and profound and maybe even rigorous kind of spiritual grounding in something.
Mhm. It was from 18 to 30, and the only reason I stopped is because I moved to the Netherlands to do my PhD. And after 10 years, Roger died from cancer, and it seemed like he was doing well. And then I just got a phone call that he had died, and that was a big surprise. And I felt like um, my way of processing the grief at the time was he didn't have a contingency plan for the charity. He didn't have a backup plan, and he ran everything in his head. I think a lot of it, and notes. And so then I went and I went to the board and I said, I've been with Roger more than anyone else, or yeah, actually that's true. More than anyone else. I think I know how to keep this going until we can find somebody who's trained, has the right certificates to do this kind of work. And I felt they needed somebody who was trained in sort of interfaith, multi-faith chaplaincy. And we found this wonderful person to take over, and that's how I ended up spending more time in boarding homes. And what was interesting was that the charities was really hard to fund. I think this is an interesting part of it, is that because we live in a culture where we want things to be measurable,
Hmm.
and we want to be able to put things on a graph, on a slide at a board meeting. And you have to put things into grant applications to get money, unless somebody and largely the charity was running quite a lot on like just private donors who sort of knew Roger and understood that this was important. But that can be hard to sort of keep going. And so I was writing a lot of these grant proposals. And what's I've been thinking about this a lot, and I know this would speak to you as well, is just how could you measure the profound gift of a birthday cake to someone whose birthday had been forgotten for 20 years? And then you brought their birthday cake. Or fixing somebody's guitar who hadn't been able to play and couldn't get their guitar fixed for years because they couldn't afford the $20 repair. And now they could finally play. How could you even express those, except for me to just say them to you, and I know that you understand that and you can feel that. But that's not something, it's not really good on a graph.
Yeah, yeah.
So it was hard to fund, and actually after the charity didn't make it through COVID, I should say. So
Right.
yeah.
Chippers, I think if you're going to give me one more example there, I was just going to erupt in tears. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
which would have been no bad thing, but at least I guess this way I get to carry on the interview.
Mm-hmm.
How beautiful an observation that is, though. Like, and I really think, even in so much of, let's say, even the work that gets done corporately that are looking for different ROIs on things as well, and or different proofs,
Mm-hmm.
or as you mentioned there in terms of needing grants, it's so fixated on outcomes and not how human beings feel, and it seems like we've reduced the lived felt experience of life um, to something subordinate to something that we can measure, which, even I think if we all reflect on our own lives, like sometimes I wonder, like, would you have walked at all if your watch doesn't tell you how many steps you've walked? Like, that's probably for another day and
Yeah.
another tangent. One thing I really wanted to ask you about, obviously, I'm fascinated with the experience of silence in relationships and in groups.
Mhm.
Just from your experience, what did you notice over such a long period of time in your relationship with the silence, and then even how your shifting relationship with the silence affected your relationship with the people that you were sharing it with?
Hmm. I hated the silence at first. Like
Yeah.
for a good year, I think. I was 18 years old and I I was just I think at the beginning I followed probably what a lot of volunteers maybe start out with, and it kind of understood as this like charity context a little bit. Like I wanted to go and do some good. And this is
Of course.
and Roger, yeah, of course, classic. And Roger just would have none of this. Like Roger just had he could smell a good intention from a mile away, and he was not there. He was not there to support that. So I was lucky to be paired under the mentorship of somebody who wanted something other than good intentions, and he wanted presence,
Hmm.
and he didn't want those outcomes. He wanted me to be there. And sometimes being there meant sitting in silence. And I would find it really difficult, I think, in terms of the body feeling, with just like immense stress and almost like the words almost coming out, like just like almost leaving my mouth because I'm like, I can't take it anymore. I got to say something. I got to ask somebody something. And then sometimes I even would ask something and then it would just be a one word answer. And then we sink back into the silence. I was like, oh, okay, so I think in some ways I sort of submitted to the silence under the care of my mentor, who, had he not been there, maybe I would have done a little bit more trying to chat. And but I knew that he was clear that we he that of the power of the silence. So I knew not to do that. I was under his watch. And then slowly and surely, yes, it was such a deep thing. And sometimes there was such relief in the silence, just being able to go into a room, but still be together so intimately. And you can hear each other's breath. And there, we'd always bring chips. So you'd hear people crunching the chips. And it just wasn't awkward. Um,
Yeah.
it just lost its. I was the one who was awkward, not anybody else. Everybody was fine sitting there. Yeah.
I I think that if there's something that we really underappreciate, it's just the sheer value of our presence,
Mm,
of simply being there. And it's amazing to me the ways that we've dressed up, or that we try to create value for ourselves almost by offering the advice, by trying to
mm,
fix people.
yeah.
And, at times, if somebody comes to us and says, what would you do? Like, I'm not saying that this isn't an absolute with any of these things. But I think because we've got such a proclivity to fill the empty spots, or even what we might perceive to be dead air,
Mhm.
we don't almost give the chance to notice the subtlety of, like, the interconnection of our beings. And I think when we sit in silence for long enough, that becomes actually quite a tangible experience almost.
Mhm.
And that you're really, the I forget the poverty of companionship.
Mhm.
Like, I can't think of a more beautiful antidote than just somebody sitting there in silence with me.
Yeah.
Like, of course, there can be belly aching laughter and all of these things that occur in a relationship or a friendship as well.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, that's a really beautiful expression for him to note.
Mhm.
There was one thing I wanted to go back to for a bit, just because I thought it was a really beautiful expression, and it's related to that sense of bravery that you experienced after the birth of your daughter. And just curious how that came to be felt, or how it kind of manifested in maybe even initially feelings and then into some sort of actions, or whatever way that occurred for you.
Mm-hmm. We have to go to the pregnancy.
Sure.
And when I was growing up, I never heard a good birth story. I had only heard that I had sort of understood that you had to endure the birth and it would be immensely painful, but you'd get the child, hopefully. And that was sort of the payoff. It was like almost like an economic thing. It's like you have to invest. You have to or I don't know, put this investment in, and but you'll get the baby, and it'll be really hard, but it's important. It's worth it. And I'd been fearful of childbirth since I was little, because I just never saw anything different. I didn't see it in movies. I didn't hear it in stories. I hardly heard about birth at all, except for my mom, who had understood it in this painful way, or experienced this painful way, because that was her context. And when she knows about my births now, she thinks, oh, I wish I had even known that this was possible. And so what happened when I was pregnant with my daughter, I thought, no, my body somehow said to me, there's another way. And I think I knew that also because much of my work is in feminist philosophy. And I was kind of like, I just don't buy that women are able to get pregnant and have children, and it has to be this big, horrible thing. Like, something is up with that. Like, I have to look into this. Something can't be quite right here. So then I started doing a bunch of reading into it. And I started to realize, and unfolding the sort of medical industrialization complex around pregnancy and birth, and the fearfulness and the patriarchal viewpoints, fearfulness, and also birth is made into this. It's supposed to be optimized and efficient. like I just can't really believe that that you're supposed to book. In some countries, like the States, or in Canada, is you can sort of book your time to get induced, because that's when the hospital can put you in the schedule. And the child is not even given their own time to say, I'm ready.
Right.
Today's the day. And so I was lucky to give birth to my children in the Netherlands. They allow for, the norm is home birth, and they have a whole system set up for that. In Canada, where I'm from, that would be very unusual. I'd have to do a lot of work to set it up. For here, it wasn't. And so I'd done all this reading. I did for the first time in my life, I did this deep inquiry into what was soothing to me, because I knew the safest thing for the baby and for myself was to be soothed. Not to soothe the baby, but to soothe myself. I was very clear. I just had this very clear thought once I did enough reading. I thought, oh, it's me. Like, I have to take care of myself completely. And that's how the baby will be healthy. And isn't that so true in the days and weeks after the birth, too? So I set up the house the best I could to take care of me, and then I would take care of my daughter. And in the birth, it was long. And I went through this process of really consciously sort of doing my deep breathing. There was this cool space music on, and candles in the house, and it was all so long. This was all still very conscious, pretending to submit to the process.
Right.
It was very tidy. I probably looked pretty. It's not really what we need to birth a baby.
Yeah. Reverend Rogers wasn't buying any of this. Reverend Roger was.
No, he'd be like, yeah, right, lady. It's going to have to get messier than that. And so after about 30, so the whole birth was 36 hours, and it was very beautiful. But nearing the end, what was required was me to actually submit to it. And in the previous hours, I had been trying to control the submission, the surrender. I've been trying to control the surrender. But what was required to birth the baby was submitting to it.
Right.
utterly and completely and fearfully, I think. And I think, and then I was frightened in the end, and it was like I was able to hold. I was frightened. I was excited to meet my daughter. I was so happy to see my husband, excited that he could see her sort of like coming out a little bit. And then, but I was scared, and then I thought, I just have to do this. Like I'm the only one that can do this right now. And then I pushed her out, and then she was there, and it was very beautiful. And I think that that experience was, that experience of that birth was so like an example and a metaphor of so many other parts of my life where it's like letting go, like setting things up in a soothing way, but having to actually surrender, not do the pretend surrender, and then being brave enough to be with the fear anyways.
Oh, that's lovely. I don't know, there's just something, there's something very profound about the birthing experience, even just from someone who's observed it, um, which I think you kind of nod to there, that are when terms like efficiency become a part of the process, that it really, I don't know, that it can really take that opportunity away. I've talked to a number of people that I've interviewed now, and whether it was during the interview or afterwards, for so many women that I spoke to, there were some really profound realizations that occurred through their experience of birth, and just the way you described it there, and going through that. And I can only imagine how bravery, or if a sense of bravery or connection would be found in that process, and then, as you say, like can shape us for whatever else that we're encountering in life as well.
Mm-hmm.
Between and where we opened up, Madelaine, with the the idea of listening to this feeling, almost like to not to go beyond the extremities of your body, but not to recede too far back into it. I think the term you used was being at the edges of my skin. Looking at even at times then in life, shifting from more of a logical and mental, almost like academic philosophical approach to life, to almost having these more kind of grace-filled experiences or inquiries, where we're almost called for or forced to attention. And it's an interesting, I think that sums up very much. I think in hindsight, I call it a calling. In in the present moment, it felt like more of a forcing. Listening to when the body calls us back, the inquiries or the experiences that lead to a very embodied feeling, I think, of death and its urgency sometimes, or the life that it, or the what it can fill the present moment of life with, engaging with grief, this wonderful influence in your life of Reverend Roger Hunter, like in just this, present, this poverty of companionship that he noticed, this agenda-free presence that it left you with, almost a spiritual grounding. And then just hearing here right now of just the sense of bravery that you developed, or the relationship you developed with that through birth. Really curious to hear your answer to the question of what is a good life for you.
Oh, thank you for that summary. I like great. Oh, of course, I've been thinking about the question, and as somebody who's trained in, as I said, philosophy, but it's a lot in ethics, and ethics a lot of times can be talking about what is a good life for many people, or people in general, or life on the planet. And I'm becoming less and less interested in coming up with a generalized answer at all. And I was thinking about the lines from the poet Robin Morgan. Hate generalizes, love specifies.
Hmm.
And this phrase comes to my mind all the time. And certainly I learned about it with Roger in this practice of deep recognition, I think is what we were up to. The way that he recognized me, and this is such a gift to be recognized in fullness. And it's because it's this embodying, inhabiting the specificity of your life. And to me, that's what a good life is for me, is to not miss with this sort of with the backdrop or the maybe this sort of constant infusion in my thoughts about the fact that I won't be here one day. I want to pay attention to this day. I want to pay attention to my daughter today in the words she's saying now, not, what words she might be saying, or like, won't it be interesting when we can have full conversations? It's pretty
Yeah, yeah.
interesting right now. um, and so just rooting deeply into the specificity of this precious life. And then maybe I call on the other poet who guides me, Mary Oliver, and say, what are you going to do with your one wild and precious life? It's this one. It's very particular. It's it's sort of, and it's calling for you to pay attention. I think life is right there if only we would attend to it.
This resonates so deeply with my own experience, and I think so many of the things you've touched on in this conversation, either you've given me new words or ways of articulating it, or even to a difference in the subtlety in the way that I was looking at it. So I hope for anyone who's listening to it, they appreciate it as much as I have. And just to say a big thank you for joining us today on the What is a Good Life podcast. I really, really enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.